So now we're going to move on, and we heard a lot in this last session as well about the importance of building regulations and standards. So not just the building, but the regulations and how important they are. So I'm here, I'm going to introduce you. This is Ana Campos. She's our lead DRM specialist working in the Africa region. She's going to talk to us about a new report on building regulations for resilience in Africa, along with our colleague Keiko. Yeah, Sakura. I was going to call you the wrong Keiko for a second.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is a great pleasure to be here today discussing about building regulations. And I don't think I have to tell you about the importance of building regulations because my previous colleagues in the previous panels have already highlighted. What we are going to share with you today is the status of the building regulatory environment in Africa. And why is that important? There was a gap of information and there is a gap of information in Africa in general about investigation, knowledge, and risk, but about the status of the regulations. Every time that we were discussing with a specific client and we saw the challenges that they have in building regulations, we didn't know if that was a specific case, an outstanding case, or it was the general situation of Africa. So we decided to conduct a research, and we have been working in this for 1.5 years. I'm very happy to say that it's really hot out of the press. It just came out today, and we're going to be sharing it with you. It's outside after this presentation. Next, please. Oh, I have it here too. Okay, so what was the purpose of this study? Was really to establish a baseline of the current status of building regulations in sub-Saharan Africa, made a comparative analysis of the regulation across the different countries, and make recommendations on how to fill these gaps. Why this was important? Really to create awareness and to call the attention of the governments and the different development partners on the opportunities to really create an effective risk reduction environment through building regulations in the continent. In that sense, what we did is we created a survey. We distributed among the 48 sub-Saharan African countries. We received, in average, 1 to 4 responses from the countries. Those were sent to the national authorities in charge of the regulatory environment, to the local authorities in charge of the control and implementation and enforcement, but also to practitioners in the private sector to validate the information that we were receiving from the government counterparts. Those surveys were complemented with desk research, accessing directly the different documents that the governments had, and also verifying the information with several interviews. In this sense, we needed to create a framework for the analysis, and as someone was mentioning before, we needed to understand resilience to what, resilience how. And for that, so we analyzed 7 different types of building provisions or building designs provisions, from the classification of use, height, densities, to the structural stability, the inclusion of disaster risk, parameters, and hazard maps, and performance requirements, and fire safety to verify safety and resilience advances in these different specifications. We also analyze aspects related with universal accessibility, with services and facilities, but also specifications for green buildings. And of course, the enabling environment for the enforcement. So we analyze the building control requirements and applications, and not only for new buildings, but for existing buildings, for private and public buildings, and even for traditional or vernacular type of constructions in Africa. In that sense, I don't think I have to highlight why this assessment was important, but why was the first regional assessment that we conduct in one of the continents? Africa is the highest urbanizing region in the world, and it is expected by 2050, the population is going to double. That means that 88 billion square meters are going to be built in the next 40 years to accommodate those urbanization and population growth demands. The impacts of climate change are already evident, and we have seen that in the last 40 years, the number of tropical storms have increased 4 times, and the number of floods have increased 10 times. So in that sense, we are not only seeing the rates of urbanization, the rates of increase on the different climate impacts. Of course, in Africa, nobody thinks of Africa exposed to seismic also low, activity, but it's also one element to consider, and that is very important. But one of the most important elements is the chronic problem of low quality in the African construction context. 56% of the urbanization development in sub-Saharan Africa is informal. So it's not only the quality of 1 or 2 floor buildings that are being built in those hazard-prone areas, but also is what's happening with 5 to 8 floor buildings in the urban context. In the last 23 years, 200 structural collapses had happened in Nigeria, and not related specifically with hazards, is because the buildings cannot withstand their own weight or their own loads. The same is happening in Kenya. 87 buildings have collapsed only in the last 5 years. And I'm talking here about 5 to 8 floor buildings. So this is not only about the vulnerability of the informal settlements, it's the vulnerability in the built environment in the cities like Lagos and Nairobi. So the studies have confirmed that every dollar investment that is done in risk reduction, in improving codes, and informing risk-informed designs will yield $11 of benefit. So in this sense, let me show with you some of the key findings and some of the preliminary results. So lack of risk-informed and up-to-date building regulations. Of the 48 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, only 25 of them have any provisions related with designs. And those are not comprehensive and do not cover all the aspects of resilience, universal access, or green buildings that we are generally expecting. There is a high legacy of the colonial era regulations. Many of these countries still use some of the building regulations of the pre-colonial times. They have not been adopted to the context of the climate and the different hazards of the country. So we cannot compare the exposure that buildings have in Mozambique, for example, that they have in Portugal, because we don't have tropical cyclones in Portugal, for example. But I'm not talking also and only about complex building regulations for sophisticated buildings. It's a lack of provisions for common and small scale construction types. The lack of regulations even for the typical typologies and the typical materials used in the African context. But, and not last but not least, the need to improve the effective building regulation control. There is lack of capacity of the building authorities, lack of resources, and although most of the countries have regulations related with building permits, they are not really enforced. So let me show you some examples. So of the 48 countries, 3 countries don't have any building regulatory framework: Eritrea, Somalia, and South Sudan. Of those, 20 countries have regulations related with building construction permits, but no provisions on the regulations. So permit for what? Against what? What are you measuring on the building permits? Of the 25 the remaining countries, only 16 have some type of provisions, but they do not cover all the thematic areas or the aspect that we should be expecting to have resilient, green, and inclusive buildings. Only 9 countries have comprehensive provisions. 4 of them have not been updated before 2000, like Angola, Eswatini, Kenya, and Namibia. Although they are comprehensive, they are not updated. And only 5 countries have comprehensive regulations that have been updated after 2000: Ghana, Rwanda, South Africa, Nigeria, and Uganda. But they still have some gaps, as we were going to see ahead. So what type of constructions are these building regulations covering? Most of them are covering the typical imported typologies that we see across the world: steel, concrete, masonry. Very few of them are covering the typical constructions of adobe, earth or timber constructions typical in Africa. So what are the conclusions? That under half of the countries in the regions have some kind of provisions. They are not comprehensive enough. They cover some aspects related with classified use, structural stability, service of facilities, or universal access, but they do not cover all the aspects that are needed. Around half of them also have some kind of fire provision or fire safety provisions, but they are not detailed enough. And only 1/3 of those countries have provisions related with disaster risk management, any elements related with wind load, earthquake loads, or the impacts of any other type of hazards. So let me show some examples on what I mean here. So 14 countries have provisions related with wind loading, but only 1 country in South Africa has really a strong wind parameters to be incorporated in the design and have some wind-specific maps. So that means that countries, for example, like Angola, mention the need to design against wind and the walls to be resistant to wind, but they don't specify the parameters that have to be used for those designs or the specifications of how to link the roofs to the walls. So they have partial information, but it's not going to be effective enough because it doesn't have the information that the designers and the different professionals require. The same happens with earthquake loading. 12 countries have some information related with seismic design. Only Ghana, Rwanda, South Africa, and Uganda have more comprehensive specifications and have been updated after 2000. But let me just give an example, of Rwanda. That is one of the most comprehensive ones. It doesn't have the detailed provisions to provide the buildings the ductility that they need. So although they have some hazard parameters and some specifications, it doesn't have all the elements required to really guarantee a good behavior of the buildings. So in that sense, there is a huge need and opportunity to improve the content of these regulations. From the enforcement side, also, the situation is very similar. So 45 countries have some ways of building permits or building controls, as I mentioned, but not provisions against which to compare with. But 14 countries, for example, require material testings, but those are not implemented. Only 17 countries require some specific permits after the constructions have been executed, but there is a lot of gap in the implementations. So although the regulations are there, the capacity of the cities and the different control agencies to enforce it is very limited due to financial and human resources limitations. So the results: increased loss of light and damages to property, and all the challenges that we are already seeing in the sustainable development. So what are the recommendations or the next steps? What we found is that 23 countries are working in improving their building regulations or developing their building regulations for the first time. So we have a huge opportunity to provide technical assistance to these countries to make it right, to make it comprehensive, and to use the latest knowledge and status in building regulations worldwide, to make sure that this is done through a participatory process, that we involve not only the different government stakeholders at the national level, but the control authorities at the local level, communities, and the building practitioners to tailor whatever is going to be regulated according with their needs and with their capacity. So it's not only to import what already exists, but to be able to tailor to their needs. Conclusion, of course, obvious, a need to more up-to-date comprehensive building designs, but also to make sure that we tailor them to the specific hazards in each of the specific countries. As we were mentioning, is earthquake resistant, wind resistant, flood resistant, according with the hazards and the specific challenges that each of the countries are facing, and reflecting the changes in the different technologies, materials, and construction materials available in the market. One important aspect, we were able to verify that only 7 countries of the 48 countries in sub-Saharan Africa are saying that they are informing their building permits with hazard maps. So that means that how and where do we build? It is important if we don't feel those hazard informations at the local level, and condition and restrict any development according with the specific local context and the specific hazards in each of the cities. There is a need to fill gaps in the coordination between the planning agencies and the building permit agencies. They are working in a separate way, and we need to define better where and how to build to really get the effective resilient elements that we are looking for. I know everybody think, and I hear every time, I mean, and I am earthquake engineer and I'm passionate about this subject, but everybody tells me, Anna, this is a complicated topic. It takes countries several years to get their technical work on building regulations and to get it approved. Why bother about it? I mean, it's obvious if we don't do it, it's going to continue happening the way that is happening, but we need to work not only in the complex and sophisticated building regulations, probably for the larger buildings, but in simplified provisions for the smaller buildings. The example that you just showed in Mozambique is an example of how we can improve the construction in a specific sector in a country that doesn't have a building regulation. So we can go step by step. We can work in safer construction guidance for housing. At the end, it's almost 80% of the construction that is happening, and 1 or 2 floor buildings probably are the most frequent buildings that are happening. So we can work in parallel to create booklets, manuals, awareness, training for more affordable buildings in low-income sectors while we develop more sophisticated regulations and guidelines. But also there is a need to fill the gaps of the existing buildings. Due to the high level of informality, we need to generate recommendations on how to regularize and improve those existing buildings that today are not conforming with the building regulatory environment. One of the challenges that we found is that the information is not publicly available. The building codes are sold, probably sometimes expensive for the practitioners, and are not widely disseminated. So we need to change that. That has to be accessible online, available, free, and we need to really train and capacitate those that have to implement it. Here we have an example of Kenya, how through the e-government process, they have digitalized the process and create a system that allows to get a building permit in a faster, more efficient, transparent way, and that really can make this process easier to implement, and in that way more attractive for people to get out of the informal sector and try to do it in a formal way. Due to the lack of capacity of the local governments and the lack of resources, we need to find a way also how to prioritize and how to adopt risk-based approaches for building control. So in that sense, according with the category of the building, the type of use, the size, the square meters, and other different parameters, they can decide what type of buildings really need a stronger control measure and need some permits and probably visits within the construction, etc. So according with these categories, they can prioritize. There has to be also another strategy to bring the private sector to help in that process. And there is a lot of examples worldwide on how the private sector is contributing to improve those building control process to make it more effective and faster so we can respond to the huge demands that the cities are having. Capacity development at all levels, national level for the agencies working in development of the regulations, at the local level for those in charge of enforcement, but also professionals and not professionals related with the building construction sector, and even with the community to get a larger demand for safer, greener, and inclusive buildings in general. There is also a huge opportunity to work at the regional level. Most of these countries share the same challenges. Some of them are more advanced than others. So the opportunity to share across the different countries and to make this process more effective, and not all countries have to reinvent the wheel again and do it in a separate way, and working regionally can be a work of really leapfrogging this process and improve it in a faster way. So I have shown today a specific case of what Africa is and the challenges in Africa, but I wanted to finalize this presentation from according with what the global program is doing. We are working in more than 20 countries across the world, creating knowledge, building capacity, conducting building regulatory capacity assessments at the country level, providing detailed reviews and technical recommendations to some of those specific codes according with the government needs, and capacity building for testing, for process review, and for different mechanisms for the implementation. Thank you.
I think we need to move to the next session, but if we have any question, and also we wanted to mention that as a program, we are very grateful for the partnership because, you know, as Anna mentioned, many African countries, for example, they're still using like old British standard or, you know, any European code. And many people studied in the Europe. So, you know, they have very close kind of, you know, technical understanding of, you know, what is happening in Europe, for example. But in other regions, for example, in Latin America, Caribbean, they have more close relationship with US, for example. In Asia, we also see a lot of countries looking into example from Japan, Singapore, India. So, you know, we would like to, you know, enhance more kind of collaboration with the partners and our client countries. So we are very grateful for have this opportunity to interact with, you know, different countries' representatives. So yeah, if there's any questions on the floor. I guess we're all tired. Over to you, Zoe.